The American Old West was, during the second half of the 19th century, a stage where violence and myth easily intertwined. In that territory of expanding frontiers, where the law arrived late and armed men imposed their will, figures emerged who embodied the outlaw. They were not mere thieves. They became symbols of a turbulent time, feared both for their crimes and for the fascination they stirred in later stories. Among them, names still resonate: Billy the Kid, Jesse James, John Wesley Hardin, each with his own path to infamy, left a legacy of fear and bullets in the history of the West. Henry McCarty, known as Billy the Kid, was born in 1859 in New York, although his fate soon took him to the Southwest. Orphaned at an early age, he grew up in a hostile environment, surviving through odd jobs and petty thefts. He was short in stature, with a youthful smile that contrasted with his reputation as an early killer. His first arrest occurred at the age of 16, accused of minor theft. Shortly after, he escaped from jail, beginning a career that would make him a legend. Billy was not a simple thief. He was a central figure in the so-called Lincoln County War, a conflict between rival factions of ranchers and merchants in New Mexico, where economic disputes were settled with lead. It is said he killed his first victim at barely 17 years old and soon accumulated a fearsome reputation. Quick with the revolver, accurate with the carbine, willing to shoot before negotiating. Newspapers nicknamed him the Kid, a moniker that fueled his aura as a rebellious boy facing the adult world. The number of deaths at his hands has been exaggerated on multiple occasions. Some chroniclers attributed 21 murders to him, one for each year of his life. Historians agree there were fewer, though enough to make him a feared spectre in every saloon. His end came in 1881, when Sheriff Pat Garrett shot him dead in Fort Sumner. The young gunslinger's death at 21 did not end his story. It opened the door to decades of mythification, rumors of survival, and ballads that immortalized him as a rebel pursued by an unjust system. Another name that was engraved in the collective memory was Jesse James. Born in Missouri in 1847, Jesse grew up in a family marked by the violence of the American Civil War. His mother sympathized with the Confederates, and the young man soon joined the guerrillas known as bushwhackers, who carried out brutal attacks against Unionist farmers. That war experience turned him into a ruthless man, accustomed to blood and plunder. After the war, Jesse and his brother Frank found in bank and train robberies a natural continuation of a life of violence. Their gang of outlaws became famous for attacking convoys full of cash and, on occasions, railroads of large companies, which earned them the sympathy of certain sectors of the population, who saw them as a kind of avengers against the powerful. Reality, however, was far from romanticism. Jesse James did not hesitate to murder innocents, to shoot at bank employees and customers, to sow terror to secure his loot. In 1876, after a failed robbery in Northfield, Minnesota, his gang was practically annihilated, although he managed to escape. For years he lived as a fugitive, constantly moving, until in 1882 he was betrayed by one of his own men, Robert Ford, who shot him in the back while he was hanging a picture in his house. The news of his death spread across the country. Some celebrated the end of a murderer, others mourned him as a rebellious hero who had challenged the system. His figure, like that of Billy the Kid, fed on popular folklore, in songs and legends that presented him as an American Robin Hood, although his victims remembered another reality. If Billy represented the wayward youth and Jesse James the guerrilla turned robber, John Wesley Hardin was the purest portrait of excessive violence. Born in Texas in 1853, Hardin grew up in an environment where human life had little value. According to his own memoirs, he killed his first man at the age of 15 in a school fight that escalated with knives and pistols. From there, his life was a continuous trail of corpses. It is said that he killed more than 40 people, although the real number was probably lower. Still, his acts made him one of the most feared gunmen. Hardin was known for his explosive temperament and his willingness to kill for any reason, from gambling disputes to trivial arguments in a tavern. His reputation for cruelty preceded him. One of the most cited anecdotes says that he shot a man who snored too loudly in the next room of an inn. His reputation made him a ghost roaming Texas, facing both ordinary citizens and law officers. He was finally captured in 1877 and sentenced to prison, where he spent almost 2 decades. Upon release, he tried to rebuild his life as a lawyer, but old habits and enemies followed him. In 1895, he was shot in the back of the neck in a salon in El Paso. His epitaph reflected the irony of a man who lived and died under bullets. Here lies John Wesley Hardin, beloved husband, father, and lawyer. The man who never refused to face another man beyond these famous names. The West was full of lesser-known gunmen who spread fear in every region. Clay Allison, for example, was remembered as a violent man who enjoyed undressing in public and terrifying the inhabitants of New Mexico. Wild Bill Longley was another Texan whose criminal career left dozens dead before he was hanged in 1878. Each of these men represented a chapter of brutality in a country expanding its borders westward without solid structures of justice or order. Wherever the law did not reach, revolvers dictated the sentence. Outlaws were feared by their victims, but also admired by those who saw in them a symbol of defiance. At a time when large railroad companies, banks, and powerful ranchers hoarded wealth, there were those who justified the violence of these men as a form of resistance, although in practice their crimes did not distinguish between rich and poor. The press, always eager to sell copies, magnified their exploits, creating a mythology that blended reality and fiction. Bullets and ink joined forces to forge the legend of the West. Each death in a duel, each bloody robbery, each spectacular escape became a story that circulated by word of mouth, igniting the popular imagination. Lawless towns. The westward advance not only involved the conquest of territories, but also the emergence of makeshift towns that sprang up around mines, train stations, or cattle routes. These were settlements that grew overnight, with a floating population of fortune seekers, miners, cowboys, gamblers, and criminals. In these places, the law was fragile or non-existent, and power was measured in gunpowder and money. Names like Dodge City, Deadwood, or Tombstone went down in history as symbols of lawless towns, settings where dawn duels, lynchings, saloon brawls, and murders were part of everyday life. Dodge City in Kansas was one of the most famous. It was founded in the 1870s as a key post along the route of the large cattle drives from Texas to the northern railroads. Thousands of cowboys arrived after months on the trail with pockets full of money and an excessive desire to spend it on alcohol, gambling, and women. Dodge City quickly became a boiling pot of taverns, brothels, and gambling houses, where life was cheap and violence was part of the routine. The massive influx of weapons and whiskey created an explosive cocktail that led to almost daily shootings. It was common for the dead to be left lying in the street until some volunteer dragged them off the path. Known as the wickedest city in the United States, Dodge also attracted renowned gunmen. To control the chaos, authorities hired legendary sheriffs and marshals such as Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, who tried to impose order at the end of a gun. Even so, Dodge's reputation remained as a place where crime reigned and where the line between law and lawlessness was blurred. Another of the most remembered towns was Deadwood in South Dakota. It emerged in 1876 during the Black Hills Gold Rush, a region sacred to the Lakota people that had been invaded after the discovery of gold deposits. The news spread like wildfire, and within a few months, thousands of miners, adventurers, and merchants set up a camp that soon became a city. Deadwood not only attracted workers, but also a fauna of gamblers, outlaws, and unscrupulous fortune seekers. Famous characters met their end there, such as Wild Bill Hickok, the gunman and professional gambler who was shot in the back during a poker game. The famous Dead Man's Hand, composed of aces and eights, originated from that scene in Deadwood, becoming a symbol of betrayal and fatal destiny. The city, quickly built and unplanned, was a hotbed of tensions. Murders were frequent, disputes over mining claims ended in shootings, and saloons turned into arenas of blood. Although a local government and courts were eventually established, in its early years Deadwood was the living image of a lawless town where gold justified any crime. In Arizona, Tombstone gained notoriety thanks to a duel that would go down in the history of the West, the shootout at the OK Corral in 1881. But before that famous day, the town was already a center of violence. Born around rich silver deposits, Tombstone attracted thousands of people in just a few years, multiplying its population with miners, merchants, and gamblers. Conflicts between local authorities and outlaw gangs known as cowboys kept the population on edge. Cattle thefts, stagecoach robberies, and street confrontations were common. Tension reached its peak when the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday faced the Clantons and McClorys, two clans associated with crime in the region. The duel, which lasted barely 30 seconds, left 3 dead and became a symbol of the brutality of those times. Tombstone, beyond its fame for the OK Corral, was an example of how a mining town could turn into a scene of open war between law and crime, with the population caught in the middle of the bullets. Not only the large cities of the West suffered this fate, dozens of small settlements arose along the frontier, each with its share of violence and chaos. Abilene, Wichita, or Ellsworth shared with Dodge City the bad reputation of cattle towns where cowboys unleashed their fury after long seasons in the fields. In each of these towns, the arrival of the train or the discovery of minerals transformed the initial tranquility into a whirlwind of crimes and shady businesses. Saloons multiplied their profits thanks to gambling and alcohol, but they were also the starting points of fights that ended in deadly duels. A town's life could depend on a sheriff tough enough to withstand threats and shootouts, although in many cases, corruption ended up weakening authority. The press helped shape the reputation of these lawless towns. Newspapers, eager for sensational stories, exaggerated crimes and shootouts, presenting the West as a wild territory where death lurked around every corner. Travelers' accounts confirmed that vision. Letters and memoirs narrated scenes of drunken men firing into the air in the middle of the street, corpses left forgotten by the sidewalks, card games ending in massacres. The effect was double. On the one hand, the population in the East saw the West as an inhospitable and brutal place. On the other, adventurers themselves felt attracted by that aura of risk and promise of quick fortune. Reality, however, was even harsher. In these towns, everyday life was marked by fear. Merchants closed early to avoid being caught in a nighttime shootout. Families tried to raise their children amid the constant noise of gunfire and fights. Burials multiplied in improvised cemeteries where graves were barely marked with a wooden cross. Justice was precarious. Traveling judges, juries pressured by conflicting sides, insufficient police against the growing number of criminals. In many cases, it was the citizens themselves who organized vigilance committees, lynching suspects without evidence and reinforcing the spiral of violence. Bounty hunters and vigilantes. In the violent universe of the Wild West, where outlaws spread terror and towns arose without solid structures of justice, an ambiguous figure emerged: the bounty hunter. They were men who lived by pursuing criminals, drawn by the money offered by the posters hung in the sheriff's offices or at train stations. On the doors of bars and brothels, the posters read, "Wanted, dead or alive," making it clear that the capture of the fugitive could be resolved in any way. In practice, this meant that a corpse was as valuable as a living prisoner, and many of these men preferred the faster route, a precise shot that guaranteed them the reward without risking too much. Their presence generated as much fear as that of the outlaws they hunted, because the line between justice and murder was blurry, and no one could guarantee that the hunter would not also become an executioner. Bounty hunters arose as a response to the inefficiency of the law in a vast and scarcely controlled territory. Local sheriffs could not cover hundreds of miles of desert, mountains, and prairies, nor face entire gangs with barely a couple of poorly armed deputies. Thus, the reward system transferred the responsibility of capturing criminals to individuals willing to risk their lives for money. Some were former soldiers of the Civil War, hardened by years of combat, unable to adapt to peace. Others were failed cowboys, solitary explorers, or even former outlaws who saw hunting as a new way to survive. There were no shortages of those who used the excuse of the reward to justify murders and personal revenge. Each carried a personal code where justice was relegated to a secondary role in favor of economic gain. The life of a bounty hunter was harsh. Traveling through inhospitable territories, they slept under the stars, ate what they could hunt or find in towns, and always carried weapons ready to fire. Their methods were direct. They followed tracks in the sand, bribed bartenders, extracted information by fists or intimidation. In many cases, they infiltrated the very taverns and hideouts where their targets were hiding, willing to wait hours or days before striking. The moment of capture was always violent: a shootout in the middle of the street, an ambush in the desert, or a bloody fight in the shadowy interior of a saloon. Outlaws knew that being caught alive meant the gallows, so they resisted to the death. That resistance made bounty hunters, more than pursuers, executioners. Among the most famous names is Charlie Siringo, a cowboy who became an agent of the Pinkerton Agency, perhaps the most famous private detective organization in the United States. Siringo pursued members of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's gang, following leads for months through deserts and mountains. His testimony shows the harshness of the job: infiltrations among criminals, endless travels, and confrontations in which a single bullet could end everything. Another example was Tom Horn, a former soldier who earned a reputation as a hired gun and bounty hunter in Wyoming. Horn often worked for powerful ranchers, eliminating rustlers or rivals in land disputes. His violence was so excessive that he ended up on the gallows in 1903, accused of murdering a teenager. The line between vigilante and killer was never blurrier than in figures like his. In addition to money-motivated bounty hunters, there were so-called vigilantes, men who took on the task of confronting crime out of personal conviction or a distorted sense of honor. Many of them were former law enforcement agents who could not tolerate the impunity of bandits. Others were ordinary citizens who had lost family members at the hands of outlaws and decided to take up arms. These vigilantes operated outside the system, executing criminals without trial, convinced that they were cleansing the frontier of scum. In some cases, they were applauded by communities tired of violence. In others, they were seen as killers who perpetuated the cycle of blood. The West did not distinguish between heroes and villains, and vigilantes lived in that gray area. The violence of bounty hunters reached almost mythical proportions with the spread of wanted posters. Rewards ranged from a few dollars for minor thieves to considerable sums for gang leaders. Jesse James once had a price of $10,000 on his head, an astronomical figure for the time, capable of tempting both allies and strangers alike. That money became a driver of betrayal, as happened when Robert Ford killed Jesse James to collect the promised sum. In that sense, bounty hunters were not only solitary outsiders, but also part of a system of corruption and opportunism that fed betrayal and death. The West witnessed countless stories of pursuits. A bounty hunter could follow the trail of an outlaw for weeks, riding through scorching deserts, crossing overflowing rivers, or traversing icy mountains. Every encounter was a duel anticipated. Both knew that only one would come out alive. The local population watched these scenes with a mixture of fear and admiration, for they knew that the same man who hunted criminals could turn against them if enough money was involved. In many towns, the arrival of a bounty hunter generated as much fear as that of the outlaws. Violence was inevitable. Popular literature and newspapers glorified their figure. They were depicted as solitary men with hardened faces riding against the horizon with a borrowed silver star on their chest and their gaze fixed on their prey. In reality, most were ordinary men, hardened by necessity, driven by greed, and willing to kill without scruples. The myth of the romantic avenger arose later when cheap dime novels began to circulate in the East, feeding the fantasy of readers who had never set foot on the frontier. There, bounty hunters transformed into champions of justice when in truth they were cogs in a brutal system where life was negotiated with gunfire. The decline of this figure came with the consolidation of the state and the advance of railroads, which facilitated the movement of troops and law agents. As the West became populated and organized, the space for uncontrolled violence diminished. Duels. Under the noon sun. In the imagination of the Wild West, few scenes are as iconic as two men facing each other in a dusty street, hands near their revolvers, waiting for the moment when a blink, a word, or a simple gesture will unleash a hail of bullets. Deadly duels were part of the daily fabric of many frontier towns, although they did not always correspond to the romanticism with which they were later portrayed in novels and films. Reality was more brutal, more improvised, and often more unjust. Fights born at poker tables, drunken arguments in a saloon, disputes over land or women that ended in broad daylight before the eyes of neighbors who knew that a single shot could mark the difference between life and the grave. Duels were the product of a world in which honor carried incalculable weight. In the West, reputation was almost as valuable as money, and a public insult could ruin a man's life. In societies where the law arrived late, the defense of honor was settled by one's own hands. Firearms, cheap and accessible, became an extension of personal pride. Duels were not always prearranged encounters. They often arose suddenly in the middle of a crowded saloon when a card game ended in accusations of cheating. On other occasions, they were anticipated confrontations with witnesses gathered on the main street to see who would shoot fastest. The silence before the outcome, broken by a sharp gunshot, became a symbol of an era. One of the most famous duels took place in 1881 in Tombstone, Arizona, during the OK Corral shootout. Although it was not a duel in the strict sense, but a confrontation between two factions, it remained recorded as the ultimate representation of armed clash in broad daylight. The Wyatt brothers, Virgil and Morgan Earp, accompanied by Doc Holliday, faced the Clanton and McClory gang, a band of cowboys accused of robbery and crimes. The shootout lasted barely half a minute, but left 3 dead and turned Tombstone into a legendary name. Witnesses claimed that the men barely had time to draw before falling, and the echo of the bullets resounded like a final judgment in the middle of the desert. That scene reflected the spirit of the West, a divided community, justice in the hands of gunmen, and quick death as the only certainty. Another famous duel occurred in 1865 in Springfield, Missouri, when Wild Bill Hickok faced Davis Tutt. The dispute arose over a gambling debt. Tutt had taken Hickok's gold watch as collateral, and Hickok considered it a public humiliation. Both agreed to face each other in the central square. At 6 p.m, before the eyes of dozens of citizens, the men stood 30 meters apart. Tutt fired first and missed. Hickok responded with a precise shot that pierced his rival's chest. The crowd watched in silence as the young man fell to the ground and then dispersed as if nothing had happened. The duel consolidated Hickok's reputation as one of the fastest gunmen in the West and marked the difference between an ordinary man and a legend. Speed and precision were the key to these encounters. It wasn't about prolonged shootouts, but fatal seconds in which a wrong move meant death. Most duels ended with a single shot. There was rarely time to reload. The atmosphere was so tense that, according to accounts from the time, spectators held their breath, aware that a stray bullet could reach them. Later, chroniclers embellished these scenes, describing theatrical confrontations under the blazing sun. But those who lived through those moments remembered the smell of gunpowder, the sudden silence after the shot, and the lifeless body in the middle of the street. Not all duels were fair. Often one of the contenders was drunk, wounded, or poorly prepared. There were cases of deliberate cheating, such as manipulated pistols designed to fail or hidden accomplices among the crowd. Sometimes the duel was simply an excuse for cold-blooded murder. John Wesley Hardin himself, the famous Texan gunman, recounted how he killed rivals in supposed duels that he himself provoked with insults or provocations. The line between justice and murder was so thin that many of these confrontations ended up fueling endless revenge, where entire families and gangs clashed for years. Duels also responded to the racial and social tensions of the time. Mexicans, African Americans, and Native Americans were often victims of unequal confrontations in which the honor of a white man prevailed with gunfire over the life of the other. These crimes were rarely punished, reinforcing the sense that the duel was a tool of power rather than a mechanism of justice. In mining towns, fights over control of gold or silver veins led to public shootings, while on cattle routes, disputes between ranchers ended in ambush-style duels. The spectacle was the same: 2 armed men, the expectant community, and the certainty that one would not return home. The press helped magnify the image of the duel. Eastern newspapers reproduced the confrontations in great detail, turning gunmen into heroes or villains depending on the tone of the report. Cheap and popular dime novels turned these episodes into pieces of folklore, fueling the vision of a romantic West where men fought for honor. In reality, behind every duel there was fear, anger, and blood spilled in dusty streets. Witnesses rarely remembered it as a glorious act, but as a tragedy that left broken families and divided communities. As the 19th century progressed, duels began to disappear. Stricter laws, the arrival of judges and courts, and tighter control of firearms reduced their frequency. But during the decades of the West's heyday, they were an essential part of daily life, an outlet for tensions accumulated in societies born from the gold rush, cattle, and railway expansion. Each duel was ultimately a reminder of the fragility of life on the frontier, where an insult or a glance could trigger death. Brutality in Western prisons. In movies about the Wild West, jails appear as wooden buildings with rusted bars, guarded by a stern sheriff and a sleepy deputy. That image, repeated ad nauseum, contains some truth but omits the harsh reality that defined frontier prisons. In those newly colonized territories where the law was fragile and crime constant, jails were improvised, unsafe, and deeply violent. They were not centers for rehabilitation but human warehouses where suffering, corruption, and brutality served as a warning to the entire community. The first cells in the West were little more than adobe rooms, iron cages, or damp basements under municipal buildings. Often prisoners were chained in stables, abandoned warehouses, or even outdoors, tied to a post. The lack of resources and improvisation turned these jails into places of physical and psychological torment. Summer heat would suffocate inmates to the point of dehydration, while winter frost left them shivering under tattered blankets. Insects infested straw mattresses and diseases spread uncontrollably. An arrest in the West did not mean waiting for trial. It was often a slow sentence to misery and, in many cases, death. The penitentiary system of the West was not based on prolonged punishments but on quick solutions. Many prisoners never even saw a court. In small towns, it was enough for a suspect to be accused of a crime for the community to demand a lynching. Mobs organized easily. Armed men stormed the jail, dragged the detainee out, and hung him from a tree or a beam in the square. These public executions were macabre spectacles attended by entire families, convinced that exemplary violence maintained order. The sheriff, in many cases, stepped aside, unable to contain dozens of enraged citizens. Thus, the jail became a mere waiting room for popular execution. Legal executions were no less brutal. Official hangings were carried out on makeshift scaffolds in front of the whole community. Prisoners were led with ropes around their necks while the crowd shouted insults and threw objects. Some died instantly from a broken neck, but others suffocated slowly for minutes, kicking in front of the executioner's impassive gaze. The gallows was seen as a civilized method compared to stoning or burning at the stake, but its brutality was evident. Contemporary records abound with accounts of poorly calculated executions, where a rope that was too short caused endless agony. Far from generating compassion, these spectacles reinforce the idea that jail and death were two sides of the same coin. Inside prisons, violence was constant. The guards, poorly paid and undertrained, often resorted to beatings and torture to maintain control. Blows with rifle butts, deprivation of water, or confinement in tiny punishment cells were part of the routine. In some prisons, such as the famous Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona, opened in 1876, prisoners were subjected to forced labor under a scorching sun. Built of stone on a hill by the Colorado River, Yuma quickly earned the reputation of hell on earth. There, inmates worked in chains, building walls, digging ditches, or carrying materials during endless shifts. Escape attempts were punished with isolation in dark cells called the dark cells, where the prisoner remained for entire days in dim light with bread and water as the only rations. The stifling desert heat turned those cells into real ovens. Visitors who left accounts of Yuma prison agreed in describing it as an inhuman place, feared even by the toughest criminals. Another facility that symbolized the harshness of the West was the Huntsville prison in Texas, opened in 1849. There, prisoners were employed in labor fields, chained in crews that cultivated cotton or built roads. Conditions were so harsh that many died from exhaustion or disease before serving their sentences. In a context where human life had little value, the prison system reflected the same logic of brutality that governed the streets and duels. Overcrowding was a constant problem. In mining towns, waves of arrests filled prisons designed for a few dozen people, forcing prisoners to sleep standing up or in hallways. The mix of violent criminals with petty thieves or common drunks created an explosive environment in which the strongest imposed their dominance through beatings. Rapes, thefts among inmates, and murders inside the cell were frequent, often tolerated by guards who preferred to look the other way. Prisons did not rehabilitate, they created hardened criminals prepared for violence upon release. The fear of escapes also marked prison life. Improvised prisons were fragile, with bars that could be sawed through and wooden walls easy to penetrate. It was not uncommon for communities to wake up to the news that an entire group had escaped during the night. In response, some sheriffs resorted to increasingly extreme methods, chaining prisoners to the floor, keeping them under armed guard 24 hours a day, or constantly relocating them to prevent conspiracies. Even so, escape attempts continued to be part of daily life, feeding the feeling that prison was just a parenthesis between freedom and the gallows. Accounts from travelers and Eastern journalists who visited Western prisons were unanimous. These were places of barbarity. Reports spoke of rat-infested cells, emaciated men begging guards for scraps, and improvised executions in inner courtyards. Some compared the prisons to medieval dungeons, a regression in the 19th century in a country that proclaimed itself modern and democratic. But for frontier communities, these prisons were a necessary evil, a symbol of order against chaos. The suffering of prisoners was seen as natural justice, an exemplary punishment that reminded everyone of the price of defying the law. Train and stagecoach robberies. Progress in the West arrived accompanied by symbols of modernity that transformed everyday life: trains and stagecoaches. The railroad connected distant cities and allowed wealth to be transported at high speed, while stagecoaches connected isolated settlements with trade routes and urban centers. However, these advances also became perfect targets for outlaws. Loaded with gold, cash, mail, and wealthy passengers, they were irresistible temptations for armed gangs who did not hesitate to leave a trail of corpses in their wake. Train and stagecoach robberies became the ultimate expression of organized violence on the frontier, blood spectacles that sowed terror in every valley and desert. Stagecoaches were the first victims. In the mid-19th century, before the railroad spread across the territory, these carriages were essential for transporting mail, money, and travelers. Pulled by horses and driven by brave drivers, they traveled inhospitable routes full of dangers: hostile Indians, accidents, storms, and above all, robbers. Outlaws took advantage of deserted stretches where dust covered the horizon and there were no witnesses. Armed with revolvers and sawed-off shotguns, they burst from the bushes, forced the carriage to stop, and stripped passengers and mail of all valuables. In many cases, the robberies ended in gratuitous violence, travelers killed for resisting, drivers gunned down as an example. Wells Fargo, the most powerful stagecoach company, became a recurring target. Its chests full of gold and bills were so coveted that it is estimated that during the 1860s and 1870s the company suffered hundreds of robberies. The response was to hire armed guards, mounted escorts, and ultimately private detectives like those from the Pinkerton Agency to hunt down the culprits. One of the most famous stagecoach robbers was Charles Bowles, known as Black Bart. Dressed in a long coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and a scarf covering his face, he was famous for robbing Wells Fargo stagecoaches in California without firing a single bullet. His peculiar style included leaving sarcastic poems at the sites of his robberies, which earned him a reputation as a gentleman bandit. However, most robbers were not so theatrical. They acted brutally, shot the horses to stop the carriage, and intimidated passengers with extreme violence. Stories of travelers stripped in the middle of the desert, forced to walk miles without water after the robbery, multiplied, reinforcing the fear of open routes. The railroad amplified the problem. With the expansion of tracks in the 1870s, trains became real moving fortresses loaded with wealth. They transported gold bars, payrolls for armies and mining companies, weapons and supplies. For outlaws, a train was loot in motion, riskier but much more lucrative than a stagecoach. Attacks became planned operations. Gangs removed sections of track to derail locomotives, placed barricades in the middle of the desert, or directly assaulted armored cars while passengers remained terrified. The roar of gunfire, the screams of travelers, and the smoke of the halted locomotive composed scenes that seemed taken from a nightmare. The gang of Jesse James and his brother Frank was a pioneer in train robberies. In 1873, in Adair, Iowa, they derailed a Rock Island Railroad train and robbed the passengers, killing several in the process. The magnitude of the crime shocked the country and turned railroad assaults into a new face of terror on the frontier. Shortly after, other gangs followed their example, such as the famous Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid gang, who at the end of the 19th century carried out some of the boldest heists against convoys in Wyoming and Utah. Their hits were so notorious that even insurance companies pressured state governments to reinforce the protection of railway lines, deploying armed guards on the cars and hiring private detectives specialized in tracking fugitives over thousands of miles. The robberies did not always end in success. In 1876, the James Younger gang attempted to rob a bank in Northfield, Minnesota, but the resistance of the population turned the heist into a massacre. Something similar happened with the trains. Many times the armed staff responded fiercely, and the assailants ended up dead or captured. However, the aura of the outlaws grew with each attempt, failed or not, fueled by the sensationalist press that described their deeds with epic overtones. The American people, divided between horror and fascination, saw in these attacks a mixture of barbarism and adventure. Train companies implemented increasingly extreme measures. Some armored cars included trapdoors from which guards shot at the assailants. In other cases, safes were installed with time mechanisms impossible to open during the trip. Despite this, the outlaws continued innovating, attacking isolated stations instead of moving trains, or kidnapping employees to force them to hand over the keys to the chests. Violence escalated to levels that seemed like a private war between bandits and railway companies. The Pinkertons, hired as the armed arm of the industry, relentlessly pursued these gangs, infiltrating their circles and annihilating several entire groups. But the price was high. Each failed robbery left behind the corpses of innocent passengers, and towns plunged into fear. Survivor accounts testify to the terror that an assault entailed. Passengers forced to hand over watches, rings, and wallets under the threat of a gun, terrified women protecting their children, drivers beaten until losing consciousness. In some cases, the criminals unleashed their frustration on the passengers, killing those who resisted or simply to impose fear. The line between robbery and massacre was as thin as the iron track crossing the desert. Every train leaving a station loaded with riches carried with it the specter of imminent attack. The most ruthless gangs of the West. The West was land of lone gunmen, but also of organized gangs that spread chaos across several states at once. Outlaw gangs were, in many ways, the most dangerous form of criminality on the frontier. Groups armed to the teeth with internal hierarchies, assault strategies, and the ability to openly challenge local authorities. It was not a lone bandit stealing a wallet in an alley, but entire groups capable of raiding trains, banks, and whole towns, leaving a trail of dead behind them. Among them, two names stand out with particular notoriety: the Dalton Gang and the James Younger Gang. Their fame, fueled by newspapers and folk songs, turned them into legendary figures, although their memory remained marked by the blood spilled in their path. The Daltons were three brothers born in Kansas: Grat, Bob, and Emmett. Their story began, paradoxically, on the side of the law. For a time they worked as deputy marshals in the Indian Territory, but soon crossed the line into crime, drawn by easy money and the adrenaline of heists. In the early 1890s, they formed a gang that specialized in robbing trains and banks. Their boldness reached its peak on October 5, 1892, in Coffeyville, Kansas, when they tried to simultaneously rob two banks in broad daylight. The plan was daring: enter both establishments at the same time, empty the safes, and escape before the town could react. But Coffeyville was not a defenseless town. Citizens quickly armed themselves, and a fierce shootout broke out in the main streets. Within minutes, Grat, Bob, and other gang members lay dead, while Emmett, gravely wounded, was captured. The Coffeyville failure became legendary, an example of how even the most feared gangs could fall to the resistance of a determined community. Emmett survived his sentence and later wrote memoirs describing the violence and wandering life of those years, providing direct testimony of the cost of a criminal life. Even more famous was the James Younger Gang, led by Jesse and Frank James, along with Cole, Jim, John, and Bob Younger. Emerging after the Civil War, this gang combined the military experience of its members with unusual ferocity. Their bank and train robberies spread across Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, and other states, becoming a nightmare for railroad companies and small communities. The group was expert at planning ambushes and escaping quickly, taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain and the loyalty of local supporters who saw them as avenging heroes of the defeated South. However, the brutality of their attacks belied any idealism. Employees were killed in cold blood, passengers terrified in looted train cars, entire towns paralyzed by fear. The climax of their story came in 1876 with the assault on the First National Bank of Northfield, Minnesota. The resistance of the population turned the robbery into a disaster. 2 gang members died on the spot, and the youngers were captured after a subsequent shootout. Jesse and Frank managed to escape, but the gang was practically destroyed. The Northfield episode demonstrated that even the most organized groups could meet ruin in a single failed strike. Beyond the Daltons and the James Younger gang, other gangs also left their mark on the western landscape. The Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid gang, known as the Wild Bunch, specialized in train and bank robberies at the end of the 19th century. With a more planned and less bloody style than other groups, the Wild Bunch carried out spectacular heists in Wyoming and Utah, becoming a priority target of the Pinkerton Agency. Their pursuits, which extended even to South America, helped forge one of the most enduring myths of the West. In parallel, lesser-known but equally brutal gangs, such as Sam Bass in Texas or Rufus Buck in the Indian Territory, demonstrated the diversity of organized crime on the frontier. While Bass was famous for his daring train robberies, Buck and his men spread terror with indiscriminate killings and attacks on settlers, showing the cruelest side of gang violence. The appeal of these gangs lay not only in their crimes, but in the fascination they inspired. The press portrayed them as almost mythical figures, half demons, half rebels. Dime novels turned them into protagonists of romantic adventures, softening the brutality of their acts. For some sectors, they represented a challenge to the large railroad and banking companies that enriched themselves at the expense of small farmers. That view fueled popular sympathy, although in practice the robberies did not distinguish between rich and poor. Survivors' testimonies remembered the gang members as cruel men, armed to the teeth, who did not hesitate to kill to impose themselves. The violence unleashed by these gangs forced the authorities to respond harshly. Local sheriffs, federal marshals, and private detectives united in a relentless war against organized crime. The confrontations were fierce: street shootouts, ambushes in canyons, horseback chases lasting days. In many cases, the communities themselves rose up against the outlaws, as occurred in Coffeyville. The clash between gangs and armed citizens left scenes of violence that marked entire generations. Alcohol, gambling, and violence in the parlors. In the heart of the Wild West, more than the church or the sheriff's office, the true center of social life was the saloon. Those wooden buildings with their swinging doors and the constant echo of glasses, laughter, and arguments were much more than simple bars. They were meeting points, centers of shady business, gambling arenas, and stages for violence. In a world where leisure was scarce and the loneliness of the prairies marked daily life, saloons offered a valve of escape, albeit at a price: the constant threat of an unexpected shot or a fight that could end in death. Saloons were born as makeshift businesses alongside cattle routes and mining camps. In frontier towns, as soon as a few houses and a general store appeared, a saloon soon followed, as alcohol was one of the most demanded products by cowboys, miners, and outlaws. Inside, the atmosphere was filled with tobacco smoke, the strong smell of cheap whiskey, and the metallic sound of coins on the poker table. The music of an out-of-tune piano accompanied the shouts of the players, while waitresses in flashy dresses served drinks under the insistent gaze of drunk men. The saloon was the space where frontier routine transformed into chaos. Alcohol flowed without measure. Whiskey, often distilled with poor quality, was the most common drink, served in small glasses that were repeated until dawn. Homemade liquors and spirits so strong they could cause blindness or poisoning also circulated. Excessive consumption turned nights into storms of violence. Trivial arguments escalated quickly, and an accusation of cheating in a game was enough for players to draw their revolvers. Records of the time are full of accounts of men shot in the middle of a card table, with chips still scattered on the floor and the deck stained with blood. The phrase, "shot over a card game," became a cliché in local newspapers. Gambling was another major engine of the saloon. Poker tables, faro, and other games of chance were stages of instant fortune and ruin. Professional gamblers roamed entire towns, seeking unsuspecting victims to fleece with marked cards and skilled hands. The tension at those tables was constant. Every glance, every gesture could be interpreted as a cheat, and the resolution usually came with lead. Some saloons became famous for their endless games, like the Birdcage Theatre in Tombstone, where poker was played 24 hours a day. There, the line between fun and tragedy was as thin as a knife's edge. Saloons were also refuges for outlaws and gunmen. After a robbery or a getaway, it was common for bandits to hide in these places, where the noise and bustle provided cover. There they spent their loot on alcohol, women, and gambling, surrounded by accomplices and admirers. However, that same confidence made them vulnerable. Many of the most famous gunmen met their deaths in saloons. Wild Bill Hickok fell to a shot in the back of the head while playing poker in Deadwood. Clay Allison, a notorious gunman known for his violence, died drunk after a fight in a Texas bar. Saloons were traps where the drunkenness and arrogance of armed men became a death sentence. Violence in these places was not always limited to personal disputes. Often, armed gangs would storm a saloon to impose their power, firing at the ceiling and taking money and belongings from the customers. The lack of authority made these spaces conducive to collective crimes. Lynchings, started in bar arguments, could end with men dragged into the street and summarily executed. Even sheriffs knew that entering a saloon to enforce order was risking their lives. A single spark was enough for the entire clientele, armed to the teeth, to respond with gunfire. The role of women in saloons was also marked by violence. Many were waitresses or performers hired to sing and dance, but in reality they were forced to accompany customers at gaming tables or to prostitute themselves under the protection of the owners. These women suffered constant abuse and, in many cases, were victims of murders committed by drunken gunmen. The police rarely investigated these crimes, as the victims were seen as disposable parts of a shady business. Thus, saloons became not only temples of alcohol and gambling, but also centers of exploitation and silenced tragedies. The very architecture of saloons was designed for the spectacle of violence. Swinging doors allowed anyone to enter with a push, generating the classic image of the gunman bursting in with his hands on his belt. The long counter, with bottles lined up and decorative mirrors, was often the place where patrons took cover during shootings. On the walls hung rifles, shotguns, and occasionally animal heads, reinforcing the rough aesthetic of the place. The saloon was not just a bar, it was a stage prepared for the constant drama of the West. Eastern newspapers were fascinated by these stories. Every fight, every murder in a saloon was narrated with bloody detail, feeding the image of the West as a wild territory where alcohol and gambling ruled. This reputation was not just a literary invention. Travelers crossing the frontier left testimonies of entire nights interrupted by gunfire, corpses dragged out of the bar at dawn, gaming tables covered in blood. The hard life of women in brothels and parlors. The West was the scene of gunmen, duels, and spectacular robberies, but behind that world of armed men existed a much quieter and more heartbreaking reality, that of women trapped in brothels and saloons. While outlaws went down in history for their audacity, thousands of women were reduced to commodities, forced to survive in hostile environments where violence, exploitation, and abuse were part of the routine. Their names were rarely recorded, and their fate, except for a few cases, was lost among wooden walls and endless nights of smoke and alcohol. Brothels emerged alongside the growth of mining and cattle towns. Wherever a gold seeker camp or a train station was established, women soon appeared, hired or forced, to meet the demand for male pleasure. Some of these places openly operated as houses of tolerance, run by madams who controlled dozens of women. Others operated in the shadows of the saloons, where waitresses served drinks and were pushed into prostitution behind the scenes. For many, there was no choice. Poverty, orphanhood, or human trafficking threw them into a fate marked by exploitation. Travelers from the East venturing into the West left testimony of red light districts where women, made up and exhausted, waited in poorly lit rooms, certain that any client could also be their executioner. Life in these brothels was marked by constant violence. Clients, often drunk and armed, unleashed their frustration on defenseless women. Beatings were common, and murders were barely investigated. Police records mention cases of prostitutes stabbed by gunmen who refused to pay, or women shot over absurd arguments. In most cases, the culprits were never punished. A prostitute's life was worth little before the law and even less before society. Madams, interested in keeping the business running, preferred to silence crimes rather than risk losing clients. Thus, deaths remained hidden under a veil of indifference that turned brothels into invisible cemeteries. Diseases were also part of the ordeal. At a time when medicine could barely control common infections, syphilis and other venereal diseases spread unchecked among prostitutes and clients. Many women, without access to adequate treatments, ended up marked for life or died young. Alcohol and opium, used as a refuge to endure the harshness of the routine, worsened physical deterioration. By age 30, many of these women looked old. Their bodies were the price of an industry that profited from their suffering. Some achieved a certain notoriety and power, like the so-called madams who ran the largest brothels. Figures like Madame Mustache in California or Big Nose Kate, companion of Doc Holliday, survived thanks to their cunning and ability to assert themselves in a world dominated by violent men. However, these exceptions confirmed the rule. Most were trapped in a cycle of exploitation from which it was almost impossible to escape. Women who tried to leave brothels were pursued by invented debts, threats from pimps, or simply by the fear of not finding another means of survival in a territory that offered no options. Saloons were another face of the same hell. There, women worked as soiled doves, waitresses who accompanied men at poker tables and served drinks. Their wages were miserable, and real income depended on tips obtained at the cost of enduring groping, insults, and assaults. Often they were forced to prostitute themselves in back rooms with no right to refuse. Violence was always present. Any refusal could end in beatings or even death. The police rarely intervened, as saloon owners usually bribed local authorities to keep their businesses untouched. Thus, women were trapped between the greed of their bosses and the brutality of their clients. Opium use added a dark chapter to this story. In cities like San Francisco or Denver, brothels were often associated with opium dens, where women were forced to take drugs to endure long working hours. Opium dulled them, made them more docile, and at the same time made them dependent on the pimps who controlled the supply. This practice spread quickly, leaving many women trapped not only by violence, but also by addiction. In some cases, desperation led them to commit crimes. There are records of prostitutes who stabbed clients in self-defense or poisoned abusive pimps. However, justice rarely favored them. Most ended up in prisons even more brutal than the brothels or on the gallows. The legal system of the West did not consider the possibility that a woman could be both victim and perpetrator. To the law, they were irredeemable criminals. The memory of these women was largely buried under the romantic myth of the West. While literature and film popularized the figure of the gunslinger and the sheriff, brothel women were reduced to stereotypes, the saloon girl in a red dress with a seductive smile. The reality was much crueler. Behind every smile was fear. Behind every shiny dress were hidden scars. Their lives condensed the darkest aspects of the West: exploitation, silence, and the certainty that violence was inevitable. The testimonies of some travelers, letters, and memoirs from the time are among the few sources that allow glimpses of this reality. They speak of brothels where the screams of beaten women went through the walls, of saloons where waitresses fell dead from a gunshot over a gambling debt, of bodies buried in nameless cemeteries, far from the commemorative tombstones of famous gunslingers. Violence against women was not an isolated accident, but a structural constant on the frontier. The role of sheriffs in the Wild West. Amid the chaos of the West, where outlaws spread terror and saloons became scenes of blood, the figure of the sheriff emerged as the only visible symbol of authority. His metal star, pinned to his chest, was not just an ornament. It represented the thin line between absolute disorder and the hope of justice. However, the image of the heroic, incorruptible, and always triumphant sheriff belongs more to myth than to reality. On the ground, many of these men were loners fighting against far superior forces, poorly paid, with scarce resources, and sometimes as violent or corrupt as the criminals they were supposed to face. The origin of the sheriff figure in the West came from the immediate need to impose some kind of order in newly born communities. When a mining camp turned into a town, the election of a sheriff was one of the first acts of civil organization. Many times these were improvised votes, where popularity or a reputation for toughness mattered more than any real experience in law enforcement. Once elected, the sheriff had to face everything: cattle thieves, cheating gamblers, drunken gunmen, armed gangs, and even crowds demanding lynchings. With barely a couple of assistants, the so-called deputies, he had to cover vast territories, riding entire days to chase criminals or mediate disputes. Loneliness and danger were inherent parts of the job. A sheriff's daily life combined bureaucratic routine with sudden violence. He could spend the morning drafting bounty notices or guarding a prisoner, and in the afternoon find himself in a shootout in the middle of the main street. The improvised jails under his custody were fragile, and escape attempts were constant. Many sheriffs slept in the same office, with the revolver at their side and their ear alert to any noise at the door. Their salaries were low, and sometimes they received a percentage of fines or bounties, which opened the door to abuses and arbitrariness. Some became genuine local warlords, imposing their own law under the excuse of order. Despite these difficulties, several sheriffs became famous for their ability to confront crime. Wyatt Earp, for example, worked as a deputy sheriff in Dodge City and later in Tombstone, where his name became forever linked to the OK Corral shootout. His reputation as a cold and calculating gunman made him a symbol of relentless justice, although his methods were questioned. He applied force without hesitation and maintained close ties with saloons and gambling houses. Another emblematic case was Bat Masterson, also sheriff of Dodge City, who, besides enforcing the law, was a gambler and chronicler, and knew how to build his own legend both with words and bullets. Wild Bill Hickok, before dying in Deadwood, had served as sheriff in Abilene, Kansas, where he imposed order with gunfire in saloons full of gunmen. These names fueled the idea of the brave sheriff, but behind them were countless lesser-known officers who died anonymously facing criminals in lost towns. The confrontation between sheriffs and armed gangs marked some of the bloodiest episodes of the West. The Daltons, the James Younger Gang, and other groups forced sheriffs to mobilize citizens as improvised militias. Chronicles narrate scenes of sheriffs arming merchants and farmers to resist attacks, knowing that without help they would be overwhelmed in minutes. In many cases, sheriffs fell in the line of duty, ambushed in canyons, shot down in dark streets, or killed from behind in crowded saloons. The risk was so high that the life expectancy in office was short. Every sheriff's star shone like a perfect target in the outlaws' sights. Not all, however, were heroes. The West also knew corrupt sheriffs bought by criminal gangs or powerful businessmen. Some tolerated illegal gambling and prostitution in exchange for bribes. Others sold information to outlaws about money movements and stagecoaches. The population, aware of these betrayals, sometimes resorted to vigilance committees that took justice into their own hands, even challenging official authority. This phenomenon reflects the paradox of the West. The sheriff, embodiment of the law, could also be part of the problem. The relationship between sheriffs and the community was ambivalent. On one hand, they represented security amid chaos. On the other, they were feared figures for their immediate power over life and death. A sheriff could arrest a man on suspicion of theft and hand him over to public lynching, or face a mob alone to protect a prisoner. Their decisions defined the fate of entire towns. In this sense, sheriffs were both judges and executioners, forced to act quickly in places where courts took months to arrive. The role of sheriffs in building the myth of the West was consolidated thanks to the press and literature. Eastern newspapers portrayed their deeds as epic tales, a single man imposing order on dozens of outlaws. Fictions about the Wild West transformed Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and others into almost invincible heroes, hiding their shadows and contradictions. 20th century cinema inherited that romantic image, fixing in collective memory the idea that the sheriff was the incorruptible guardian of justice. Reality was more complex. Many were ordinary men with virtues and flaws, trapped in a frontier where every decision could mean death. The integration of the West into the rest of the country and the pacification of the territory. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, that territory which seemed doomed to anarchy began to transform. The expansion of the railroad, the massive arrival of settlers, the consolidation of state institutions, and the advance of the federal government were weaving a network of control that gradually blurred the image of the Wild West. The process was neither immediate nor free of bloodshed, but the integration of those territories into the rest of the United States brought with it a relative peace that ended the era of gunmen and deadly duels. The railroad was one of the great engines of that change. The completion of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific in 1869 connected the East and West for the first time through a continuous railway system. This infrastructure allowed not only the transport of goods and passengers, but also the rapid movement of troops and law enforcement officers. Where a sheriff once had to ride for days to pursue an outlaw, now a telegram could alert different towns, and a train could transport authorities in a matter of hours. The railroad, a symbol of progress, was also an instrument of control that reduced the autonomy of criminals. Each new station represented the arrival of the law and the end of vast, unmonitored territories. Massive colonization was another decisive factor. Through laws such as the Homestead Act of 1862, thousands of families settled in western lands, building farms, schools, and churches. With them came a new social structure, more difficult to subject to the terror of outlaws. Communities, organized around family, religion, and agricultural production, pressured local governments to establish courts, build safer jails, and hire more professional police forces. Gradually, dusty towns of saloons and brothels gave way to urban centers with stable businesses, public schools, and local newspapers that reinforced the sense of belonging. Violence did not disappear, but it was no longer the daily rule. The federal government played a central role in this transition. The creation of administrative territories and later their conversion into states brought with it the deployment of judges, federal courts, and marshals with greater capacity for action. The figure of the solitary sheriff gradually gave way to broader systems of justice. At the same time, the army continued military campaigns against indigenous nations, securing control of the territory through forts and garrisons. Violence against native peoples was an essential part of this pacification, as the integration of the West into the country was based on the dispossession and subjugation of native communities. The peace that came for settlers largely meant the definitive defeat and marginalization of the tribes that had inhabited those lands for centuries. The economy also transformed. Gold and silver mines, cattle ranches, and railroad-driven commerce created a network of interests that favored stability. Large companies could not tolerate bands of outlaws continuing to derail trains or rob banks, and they pressured state and federal authorities to reinforce security. The arrival of agencies like Pinkerton consolidated private surveillance that complemented the official one, contributing to the pursuit and elimination of many famous gangs. The death of Jesse James in 1882, the disintegration of the Dalton Gang in 1892, and the disappearance of the Wild Bunch at the beginning of the 20th century symbolized the end of an era. Cities reflected this change clearly. Dodge City, once described as the wickedest city in America, left behind its reputation when cattle routes were diverted and families replaced itinerant cowboys. Deadwood, born from gold and violence, transformed into an administrative center. Tombstone, after the Silver Rush and the infamous OK Corral shootout, gradually faded until becoming just another town, integrated into the fabric of Arizona. Where the predominant sound had once been gunfire in the street, church bells and the bustle of markets began to be heard. The collective imagination, however, had already immortalized the Old West as a world of blood and gunpowder. Even as peace settled in, writers and journalists continued publishing stories about gunmen, saloons, and dawn duels. The dime novels, and later the first films, cemented the legend in popular memory. For many Eastern citizens, the West was still synonymous with adventure, even though in practice it was becoming a territory increasingly similar to the rest of the country. The mythification served a double purpose. It fed nostalgia for a wild time and at the same time celebrated the triumph of civilization over disorder. The 20th century confirmed this integration. With the arrival of the telegraph, the telephone, and new waves of migration, the West ceased to be a frontier to become an integral part of the United States. Cities like Denver, San Francisco, and Dallas established themselves as modern economic centers, far from the image of lawless towns dominated by outlaws. Violence did not disappear entirely, but public duels, train robberies, and lynchings ceased to be part of daily life. The sheriff's star no longer shone alone in the middle of a hostile territory, but integrated into a state system that provided institutional support.